Hello and welcome to Snide's Return, a tabletop roleplay podcast. My guest today asks us to visit the last stronghold in an ever-changed world. There we will find a hub, a place of industry and not gatekeepers. Delving deeper both under the city and also into the world created, we find it goes beyond a first-glance understanding. It is both frozen in time and yet fluid in its own continuum. This may all seem a little strange. No. Odd, you could say, but I'm sure you're willing to lean into it. Doesn't matter if you're out for a walk on the Iron Coral or strolling through the halls of glass and gold, my guest will guide us from the mundane to the arcane to the cosmic strange. It is a pleasure to welcome Into The Odd TTRPG creator, podcaster, YouTuber, blogger, and Bastionland founder, Chris McDowall. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for that. That makes it sound like I do a lot more than I feel like I do. That makes me feel like I'm a one-man industry.
You are a one-man industry.
Well, yeah, I suppose.
And we'll get to that and so everything that I've alluded to there in the introduction in a little bit. But would you mind, Chris, telling us how you got into tabletop role-playing games, please?
Yeah, so like so many people that have sort of ended up in this hobby in the UK, I think it's quite a common thing to start out with Games Workshop. Especially kind of, so this would have been in kind of the mid-90s, I believe, 94, 95. It's the classic story of a boy in the year above me at school. When I was in year 5, he was in year 6, and he brought in a load of Warhammer stuff for like show and tell sort of thing. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And he had all these White Dwarf magazines, which were just full of like the artwork and the dioramas and even like the rules that I didn't understand. Everything about it just like grabbed me. Yeah. And like almost straight away, it was like I knew this was going to be like a thing for me. With like no real like precedent. Like I'd played like board games before. Well, like Monopoly, Cluedo sort of things. But this felt like something entirely different. So that kind of, the miniature side of things is what it is. But then as part of that, I picked up a copy of, it was actually a hand-me-down from an older cousin. It was a copy of the Hero Quest board game.
Oh, yes.
And it was great, but think of the worst thing that could be missing from the hand-me-down box, of a box of Hero Quest.
Probably the rules.
Well, it was 2 things that were missing. Number 1 that was missing was the gargoyle miniature, which was like the big demon. So that was gone. Yeah. Someone had that. And then the second thing that was missing was it had the rule book, but it didn't have the scenario book.
Yes.
That had all the adventures in it. So we had to play it. The 2 changes we had to make was, when I played it with a friend, one of us would essentially be a DM before we knew what a DM was. And we just sort of made up situations and scenarios. And because we didn't have the big scary monster that was like the boss of the dungeon, I guess, we just used to put down random. I mean, we had like this Grim Reaper like little model that we had, like plastic. It was like out of a cracker. But no, it probably wasn't. I doubt crackers come with Grim Reapers. But it looked like it had come out of some macabre cracker. And yeah, we used him a lot as like just this invincible monster that we would all be terrified of. And I sort of joke that was like the day that I became a game designer, essentially, because having to fill the gaps, we made something that was we probably had more fun with it than we would have if we actually had received an intact version of the rules. So from there, I kind of then eventually discovered Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and bounced over into D&D eventually, and then kind of snowballed from there, eventually ending up with various sort of indie games and OSR style games, and eventually where we are today.
Yeah, where we are today is although it potentially seems a long way from where you started, the way you've described it, it doesn't seem very far at all. It's sort of a long process to get back to where you started almost.
Well, yeah, I think the one of the things I try and do, and I wrote this down once because I was I thought when I was having a bit of a not quite a crisis, but I was feeling a little after I released Into the Odd, I was kind of thinking, well, I want to have like a direction for how I want. I need to feel like I have a sense of what I'm trying to achieve here by making these games. And it sounds very corporate and rubbish, but I thought I'm going to come up with like a mission statement and like a kind of thing just for me. It's not going to be like on the front cover of a book or anything. But the thing that I came up with was to break the barriers between your imagination and your game. And I think that it's like the holy grail I've been searching for is when I first saw a copy of White Dwarf, or I first picked up Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there was a way that I imagined the game was going to go. And everything since then has always been a little bit of a compromise in one way or another. There's been some pleasant surprises along the way, but I feel like so often we'll pick up a new RPG and we'll get very excited by it, but then there's something in the way when you actually try and realize that at the table. So I am always chasing that dream of how I imagined an RPG would be when I was sort of 10 years old, looking very confused at a copy of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Fair enough. And so you've sort of taken that corporate message. Have you got it printed up on the wall or something in front of you, or is it just something you keep in the back?
It's in the back of my. It is. I put it in a blog post. I was terrified to do that because I thought people are going to think I've got delusions of grandeur here, and but no, I keep joking that I'm going to do a strategy day one day as a company, which is just me, and go out to a lodge and I love these things. But maybe next year, yeah. But yeah, it's more just sort of like you say, it's. I think it's good to have a kind of a direction, even if you're kind of doing it in a slightly self-deprecating way. I think it is good to have that kind of a goal in mind, no matter how humble it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of starting with your, should we say, improvisation of Hero Quest, how did that go from where you were then to where you are now? So, Bastionland Press, Bastionland, and the remastered. Or the most current release of Into the Odd, which is the remastered versions. What was that journey?
Yeah, so I guess it's a journey of about 25 years. So I'll try and skip over the boring parts. Okay. Mostly the teenage years, I would say, with the boring parts. But I think the so when I was very young, I knew about Warhammer, but I was only sort of I was only sort of aware of D&D kind of on the periphery as like this thing that I knew the name of, but I had never seen it in a shop, and I didn't know anyone that played it, but I kind of knew that it existed.
Yeah.
And as such, I never played it when I was sort of young or a teenager, really, until third edition came out, and I was about 16 at that time. I think it was 2000, was it?
Yeah, I'm not a D&D historian. I think it's about then.
Yeah, I was around sort of 15, 16, around the age where I was hiding these books because I had illusions that I was too cool for this sort of thing.
Of course.
So yeah, hiding them from friends, but very much interested. And yeah, when I got into third edition, I did have some fun with it. But the thing I started to realize is, like I said, that vision that I had in my head of what this game could be. I felt like there was a lot of the game that just wasn't what I wanted to be spending my time doing, which was a lot of dealing with numbers. And I know the appeal. I can see the appeal, and I can see the appeal of a very rigorous rule system. But I wanted something that was a little bit more. I'm very impatient, so I wanted something that was a little bit more chaotic, perhaps, a little bit more freewheeling, a little bit more able to deliver on the promise of. You know, when you learn about RPGs, the thing you learn is, well, you can do anything. You can try and do anything. There's no limits on what you can do. And then you get handed a book that is a book of limits on what you can do. And and it's a balance, obviously. You do need some limits. So where I kind of ended up is I kind of drifted towards the rules light side of things. I'm going to say something that makes it sound very old. As I started to get more access to the internet, I was able to find more sort of a wider range of games, perhaps, than D&D that I had available. And sort of like just free games that people would make and put up on forums and message boards and on their websites. And the thing that I liked about these rules light games is that they felt more like what I wanted to be doing. But often those games, it would be you'd have a very rules light stripped down system, but it didn't excite me in the same way as like D&D did, because I was still drawn to, you know, D&D, you've got the big monster manual and it just fills you with ideas for what you can do. And a lot of the stuff in the player's handbook and the DMG is like exciting and it makes you want to play the game. So I always wanted something that was kind of didn't have all the rules. It had the kind of streamlined rules of something like say Rissus or Microlight 20 or all these indie games that people were making, but also had the rich kind of flavor of something like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay or D&D, where it felt like a world that you wanted to explore. It wasn't stripping back on that front. So so that soon became kind of my goal, to make that kind of game, and that kind of eventually would after lots of less than stellar attempts at making games. Into the Odd kind of felt like the first one that kind of started to deliver on that kind of goal.
Okay, so you've gone through this process, you've tried sort of rules like systems and things like that. When did you start codifying that into what became Into the Odd, and did Bastionland Press exist before Into the Odd did, or was one the sort of the output of the other?
So the sort of the timeline on it is at the time when I was started writing Into the Odd, I was really enjoying a lot of the creativity that was coming out of the OSR blogs and the OSR community on Google Plus at the time. And there was a lot of really cool ideas in there, but I still didn't really like even basic D&D. Like I will play basic D&D and like old school essentials and things like that, but I don't love it as a system. So I always thought I would want to try and it's a revolutionary idea, I know, to make your own version of D&D.
Yeah,
it's groundbreaking stuff, but I always knew that I wanted to try and do that so that I could get involved with this kind of the creativity and the exciting stuff that was happening in this OSR kind of scene, but not be kind of tied to this system that I didn't especially have an affinity for.
Yeah.
So Into the Odd started as a D&D hack, essentially. Like the name Into the Odd is a pun on OD&D originally, and it wasn't so much drawing on the specific mechanics of D&D, even though there are some kind of touchstones in there, like the names of the ability scores and HP. But I was essentially trying to make a game that you could run like a D&D style dungeon in. And then from there, it kind of picked up its own identity as I kind of played it and as I started writing about ideas for what the setting would be based around this game. And it kind of grew into this whole idea of the city of Bastion and then this weird underground and being a little bit more kind of industrial era and having horror and sci-fi elements in there. And then it kind of, that kind of grew into the Odd, which like every game I've made, I essentially made it because I wanted that game for myself. And it's the game that I wanted to be playing with other people. So Paolo Greco, who still runs Lost Pages Publishing, I forget if Paolo got in touch with me or I got in touch with Paolo first, but we already kind of knew each other through the OSR community. And we got talking about doing about publishing it. And so Paolo said, they would publish it through Lost Pages. And it was a very kind of humble, softback, 48-page, not quite booklet. I guess nowadays you would call it a zine, maybe a zine format, like 48 pages, I think it was. And it sort of gradually started to build up a little bit of people seemed to like it and people seemed to be interested in the things that it was doing that were different to other games. And that's what I really wanted. I've never had any delusions that I'm going to make a game that everybody loves. But what I would like to do with every game that I make is make a game that a few people, it really clicks with them. And it allows them to do something they weren't able to do with other games, because that's what it was doing for me, basically. It was allowing me to engage with games in a way that I found difficult with other systems. So at this point, there's no Bastionland Press. At this point, I was working as a teacher, a secondary school teacher. And after Into the Odd, about 5 years later, I did Electric Bastionland, which was my big vanity project of I want to do a big luxurious hardback book based on Into the Odd, but just going completely off the wall with having 100 different starting packages and all this artwork and everything like that. And I did that on Kickstarter, and amazingly that did well enough on Kickstarter that I was able to, at this point, that my day career was kind of reaching a bit of a crossroads where I was essentially, a contract was finishing at a place where I was working. So I reached a point where I thought, well, I could try now to make a go of this, and it might not be something I can do forever, but now is a good time to try this. And so since Electric Bastionland is what allowed Bastionland Press to exist, basically, the success of that Kickstarter. And then after that, in terms of working with Free League, I'd actually done a little bit of work for Free League before this. So before Electric Bastionland came out, Niels from Free League got in touch with me saying he was a fan of Into the Odd, and he asked if I would do a stretch goal for Forbidden Lands. Yeah. So I wrote a dungeon for Forbidden Lands as a stretch goal. And he sort of said in passing, he said, if you ever want to do anything with Into the Odd, like a second edition, come and speak to Free League. And at the time, I was doing Electric Bastion myself, so I sort of said, "Oh no, well, thanks, but I'm doing my own thing for now." And then after Electric Bastion came out, there were still lots of people that wanted. I kept getting the same question, which is people saying, "Well, what's happening with Into the Odd?" And as far as I was concerned, I was kind of happy with where Into the Odd was in my head, because I was doing Electric Bastionland, and I wanted to do something different next. But then I thought, well, this is an opportunity to do. If I could do this with Free League, or it wasn't cemented at the time, but I thought, well, if I do a definitive version of Into the Odd, then it feels right to give it that definitive version, and make the best version of that possible for the people that do really enjoy that initial game. So then, it went from there, and it all sort of started happening with Free League.
Well, the book, the remaster version, I have it here. Not only is the content and the game itself, but the presentation of the book is beautiful. The artwork from Johan Noor, who has worked on several projects for both Free League and others, just helps bring the story and the foundation of your game to life. I highly recommend it. Well, before I go into praising just how much I love it, would you like to let people know where they can find you, Into the Odd, and everything you're associated with, so I can put that down in the description below this podcast, please, Chris?
Yeah. So in terms of me, everything that I do in some shape or form is available at bastionland.com. So that's where you can find my blog, which I do every week, and it also has links to where you can buy Electric Bastionland, Into the Odd, and various other things I'm working on. And also it has links to my Patreon, Discord, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, podcast, everything you could dream of.
All right. Well, I will make sure that the links you've mentioned there are down in the description below this podcast. So please scroll down, go and click on those links and support Chris and Bastionland Press in any way you can, including Patreon, as mentioned, and YouTube and things like that. So those links will be down there. So scroll down and go and check out this book. Not just this book, but this book is the one in particular we're talking about today. So being able to sort of see this artwork and be inspired by the content that you put into this, what was the original game, now this remastered version that's been released, what were some of the elements that you really enjoyed putting into the original book that is now sort of more readily available to new fans of TTRPGs?
Sorry, just so I understand the question properly. So you're saying sort of elements of the design of the game?
Yeah.
So the big thing that I wanted to do with Into the Odd compared to, so at the time, I guess I was comparing it to like basic D&D, or I don't think OSE was really around at the time, but that's probably like a fair thing to compare it to. And the thing that I really wanted to achieve, I mentioned before that I'm very impatient, and it's in many ways it's a weakness, but it's also when you're playing an RPG, I always like to feel like things are moving forwards. So there's lots of things about it that are very quick, and it's so character creation takes about, I've been able to do it in about 30 seconds. But I think if you're teaching someone, you're probably talking about 2 or 3 minutes, if that. It's very quick at making characters. It's very immediate in terms of when you start the adventure in the game, you're kind of thrown straight into the situation that's in the game, in the book rather. Combat is just quick enough without being too quick. So one of the things that people always point out is that there's no rolling to hit in this game. When you attack somebody, you just roll damage straight away, which is kind of indicative of my design philosophy, really, because I like to chop away things until the thing doesn't work, and then put that last thing back on. So removing to hit rolls was a moment where I sort of was really happy with how it was going. So you've got combat that is fast enough that you can get through a whole lot of a dungeon in one evening, but not so fast that it's sort of over and you suddenly just randomly get whacked and you're out of the game. But yeah, mainly it was just it's an experiment in minimalism in rules and seeing how far you can strip back that formula of a game of kind of delving into somewhere dangerous. How much can you strip back without having it suddenly feel kind of arbitrary and weightless, and like you're not sort of playing that kind of game, and it's right on the bone. I've always tried to sort of stay right at the extreme end of that spectrum, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I, having sort of read through it, I really do like the combat rules in there. The mixture of, so I'm going to reference various elements, but the combat rules, I really enjoyed that. You roll in damage. If it goes over their armor, and not everything has armor, but you take the damage and you can move on, and the game progresses. The maps for the locations in the book, the dungeons, as we've mentioned, are beautifully illustrated, but they're not overly complicated. There's enough art there, but there's also enough simplicity to work through for the GM who's running the game, and the use of hex tiles effectively for the travel and exploration, I think, is such a great mix of elements. Why other games haven't done this, I'm not sure. But so slotting all these different elements in together, was that sort of challenging to make sure they all dovetailed in together? Or did you find it quite simple to sort of break them down in that respect?
So the thing is, at the time when I was writing Into the Odd, for sort of the first time around, so I should say the first release of Into the Odd was 2014. And I sort of started writing it around 2011, I think. My first blog post about it was. And all the while I was doing that, I was playing a lot of it online through Google Plus at the time. Mainly with people who were sort of, like I say, more familiar with playing like basic D&D. So it was a really good way of testing that style of game through a new sort of set of systems, because it sounds so obvious to say to test your game, but I think playtesting is like simultaneously overemphasized but also underemphasized. I don't know exactly how I managed. I think sometimes people think playtesting has to be, but I think the approach I'm trying to say is I go for a kind of natural playtesting approach.
Right.
Rather than putting it in some weird artificial situation where you're sitting everyone down and you're running them through a very artificial version of the game, just so you can make the right types of roll and hit the right types of rules. I find I have tried that kind of playtest before, and I don't find it that useful. I think just bringing it to the table, that kind of testing of not sort of almost not treating it like a playtest, but just running it as you have it, has been really useful for me. And I did a lot of that with Into the Odd. And you find problems that you wouldn't have found from sort of days of staring at the document, whether it's just to do with you suddenly realize that you're doing something in running the game and you think, well, this should be in the book. Like I'm doing something, I'm doing some kind of procedure or something that isn't a rule, but somebody reading the book wouldn't know this. So I need to put that in as a little note for the person who's picking up the book. So I think that I found it relatively straightforward to get all those systems to dovetail together, because it was being constantly put through this kind of, I was going to say organic, but that's a terrible word to use. That makes it sound really pretentious. This kind of natural playtesting, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. So with Into the Odd being this industrial period, Electric Bastionland being a little bit further on, a little bit different, what is next for Bastionland Press to bring to the table? You mentioned playtesting there, so I'm intrigued what's now on the slate under this process. Yeah,
so with every game that I've done so far, and two of them have, Into the Odd and Electric Bastionland have been my kind of big releases, I guess, but I've had like other little things that I kind of put together and put out, and I've always wanted each game to be like its self-contained kind of thing. So to play Into the Odd or Electric Bastionland, you don't need to know that the other one exists. I think if you have both, there's probably things you can pull on from each, and there's some nice kind of thematic connections between the two. But I've always wanted them to be kind of self-contained. So I joke, because the name Electric Bastionland started as like a bit of a joke, and then I ended up actually doing it. So I then joked that the next book should be called Intergalactic Bastionland, and I should do a space version, which I did mess around with for a little while, but I couldn't quite get the idea to stick in my head. I couldn't quite get to grips with it. I'm sure it will be something I go back to at some point, but that's currently not sort of something I've got to grips with. But then the thing I'm working on at the moment is a game called Primeval Bastionland, and I didn't want to just make like reskins of the same game, like just for the sake of it, and be like, oh, here's the here's the medieval one, and here's the Renaissance one, and here's an ancient version of the game, and just kind of go through and change the equipment list and call it a day. I wanted it to be something different. So Into the Odd was kind of born out of this, like I say, this kind of dungeon crawling style of play. Even though it does do other things, it was very much born in the dungeon. Electric Bastionland it still has that kind of dungeon style, but it was more based around more character-driven, city-based, weird like city exploration style of play.
Yeah.
And what I've felt like I was missing, and what I wanted to try something that focused on, was something that really went big on this kind of idea of, you spoke a little bit about hexes Into the Odd. There is a little bit of a hex crawl in there, but I wanted something that kind of explored that kind of hex crawl wilderness, exploring a wilder road without a wilder world without kind of trails and roads and obvious kind of paths. So that's what's currently happening with Primeval Bastion. It's kind of the history that never was of Bastion. So I'm very keen to avoid having like a canonical timeline. So the kind of vision in my head at the moment is this is the version of the past that people in Bastion tell themselves is true. But if you walk in the right direction away from Bastion far enough, you might end up in that kind of mythic past. So it lets you get away with a lot when you say this is a mythic past, not the actual past.
Which is fair.
Yeah,
and
it's a fake past of a fake place. So really, I've got free reign to
of your own creation. So absolutely. So I've had a look, because the playtest at the time of recording, the playtest of Primeval Bastionland is available on your website, on your blog post, so I've downloaded and looked through, and I have to say, the knights you have, I know if people can get across and have a look before it's sort of, if you listen to this in the future and it's released as a full game, I hope you're enjoying it as much as the way it looks and is inspiring to me, because some of the knights, the Moss Knight in particular has caught my attention, but not only is the artwork beautiful, the knights, and I realize it's a playtest and things could change, but it just sings to me, this project you've got going on at the moment.
Well, it's I'm having a lot of fun with it. I ran the first proper. I've done the kind of rubbish artificial tests that I told you about, where you literally like sit and run a combat by yourself at the table just to make sure the numbers kind of work, which is I've said that it's not especially useful, but sometimes it's kind of something you kind of have to grind through just to check something. But yeah, last night I actually did the first actual full sort of at the table playthrough with 2 people I know and 2 brand new people, because it was a kind of a meetup club that I go to each week. Okay. And it went about as well as I can expect a first playtest to go. I feel like it has legs, but that's the thing. Like I feel like you can fine tune the rules and you can fine tune the procedures and the guidance, but the thing that you need to make a game work, I think, is that thing that gets somebody excited. So the fact that you said, you've seen this knight and you thought, oh, this is cool, I want to play this character. I think that's the biggest hurdle for a game. And there's so many games that I've read, and this isn't me trying to, slam other games, but sometimes you'll pick up a game book and you look through it and you think, yeah, this all sounds really good, but I don't know what I want to do. Like, I don't know. I can't work out how this would work at the table. And that can be the sort of the hardest thing to do. So I'm glad that I've at least got a little bit of that going for it already. And yeah, it's a long way off from anything yet, but it's something I'm going to carry on testing for sure.
It's something that I am definitely going to be keeping an eye on for sure. So one potential customer for when it comes out, I would say. But you have explored other systems. Going through your website, you released The Doomed and Ask the Stars, very different games to each other. So you have sort of done a sci-fi based game. The Doomed is I don't want to say it reads weird. It's a different game to the others that you've released. The sort of the setup and the format of it. What inspires some of your creative choices, I guess, is the question I'm trying to fumble my way to. What inspires some of your? You mentioned sort of other influences, but what about games like those?
So The Doomed is a miniatures game, and as with so many miniature projects over the last few years, it was born out of lockdown, because obviously during the first lockdown here in the UK, just over 2 years ago now, I hadn't touched a miniature in years, if not over a decade. But it was my it was my birthday in May of lockdown, and it was a full lockdown at that point in May. And my partner and I were running out of ways to be entertained indoors. So I decided to relapse to my 13-year-old self and buy some Games Workshop miniatures and some paints. And just think, well, this is a nice thing I can do indoors and it'll be a bit of fun. And, it'd be cool to see what miniatures are like nowadays instead of the old metal things that I had to paint. And then it kind of spiraled from there to the point where I thought, well, I'll just buy one pack of miniatures. And then I thought, well, I'll buy a little bit of terrain, because you can't have miniatures like without terrain. And then I started looking at like free games that people were making. And I thought, oh, there's a lot of cool new miniature rules that aren't as complicated as the big books I used to have to wrestle with when I was playing Games Workshop games. And then it was only a matter of time until I thought I could do better and decided to try and make something for myself. So the Doomed is that essentially. There are some plans for it in the future that I can't quite talk about just yet, but there will be something happening with it, and I'll hopefully be able to talk about that in the next few months. But yeah, it's a very rules light game of you've got sort of maybe between 4 and 6 miniatures in your warband, and you are fighting some big horrible monster that you're ill-equipped to take on initially. It was another experiment to try and see what I could strip back. So there's no measuring, there's no stacking of bonuses. You can only ever get there's only ever one modifier that affects each type of roll, and there's no tracking of anything. So there's no having lots of different counters and status effects. Anything that happens is immediate, and it's very different to the miniature games. But I only wanted to do one if I could make it very different.
I mean, fair enough. It sounds like a miniature bliss to me, pun intended. Because I've looked at, again, not slamming other games and other creators, but looked at Games Workshop and ruled it out because it was too. And then they brought out Killzone, and I thought, well, maybe. And then I've seen the rule, and I'm like, this sounds like the sort of thing that you can set up quick, get into, get through, enjoy, and then put away, and just come back to it time and again without having, as you say, counter statuses, track this, track that, and worry about that. So I will probably send you an email in what is now the future, but potentially the past when listening to this, to get you back on and learn more about the Doomed project, if you'd be willing to come back.
Yeah.
So brilliant. So between game design, playtesting, I won't say organic. Oh, damn it, I said it. Between sort of working on other projects, YouTube, Patreon, and things like that. So, I mean, YouTube, you've got over 2,000 subscribers, and I'm sure many people sort of come in and check out and watch your stuff. What's it like to produce content over multiple platforms? You got your podcast, your YouTube, your blog. How do you juggle all of that?
I wouldn't know if I juggle it especially well, because the thing is, again, when I've been sort of working on games full time now for it was actually literally the week of lockdown. Sorry to keep bringing it back to lockdown, but it was literally the first week that I was due to go self-employed and start working from home on my own. All of a sudden, and it was this, everyone I spoke to about it was like, "Oh, you're so brave doing this thing, and aren't you going to go mad, like locked in the house all day on your own?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know, I think I'll be fine." And then I start doing it, and literally everybody else in the country starts doing the exact same thing. So it was a strange start, but it was also, this sounds like a terrible thing to say, but it weirdly normalized it for me as well. So it didn't feel like I was doing some strange thing, because everybody was doing some sort of strange thing back then. So when I started doing that, all of a sudden, I thought, well, if I'm doing this full time, I need to be doing everything. I need to be like throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So it's, you can't just sit and write games. Well, I certainly can't sit and write games 9 to 5, because your creativity will start to run dry pretty quickly. Monday to Friday. I'm sure there are people that can do that, but I found that is not the way that I operate. So I just started trying different things, and I soon started to think, well, why am I doing this? Like, why am I doing like YouTube things talking about my games, and why am I doing podcasts? And the fact is, I do do them as a sort of, essentially a form of marketing, I guess. But mainly, I think it's just an interesting way to get some insight into game design, especially the podcast, because it's always myself and the guest, and I try and let them talk more than I do, wherever possible, and it's just a really good way to learn. So again, it's very selfish of me, really. If I ever reach a point where I feel like I'm doing the YouTube stuff, I'm just kind of going through the motions and I'm not learning anything from it, or in doing a series of podcasts, I come away from a series just exhausted and thinking, oh, I just feel like I'm working as an interviewer or something.
Yeah.
I think then I would stop doing it. So it's at the end of the day, even though it sounds like I'm doing lots of different things, I try and sort of make it all fold back to actually making games, because that is the thing that I want to be sort of focusing on, essentially. Yeah. I've got no illusions of becoming the next Matt Colville or Ben Milton or any of these giant YouTube people.
I mean, Matt Colville is a big tall order to aim for, but
exactly.
I mean, we can but try, I guess. So, you mentioned there between game design podcast, blog, Patreon, YouTube, and all these sorts of things, you keep yourself engaged with the content, but what about downtime? Do you have downtime as a solo content creator?
Yeah, I feel guilty saying this, and like I say, for the first few months that I was doing this, I remember talking to my partner about it, and it was like a Friday afternoon, and I've been doing this for a number of months, and I sort of went to her. I don't know why I went to her, because she's not the sort of the shareholder of the company. The company is just me. But I went to her and I sort of said, I was thinking maybe this afternoon I just bought some game on Steam, like some new game, and I was like, I might take the afternoon off and like play a game. And she was like, why are you telling me? And I'm like, I don't know, I just feel like I shouldn't be able to do this. And then she said, well, in your last job, like, how many days holiday did you get a year? And I was like, well, even if I give myself the statutory minimum, like, I think having a Friday afternoon off to play a game. So I think I've now reached an equilibrium where you can sometimes, I'm sure there are people who, like I say, can graft 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, and they can just keep on grafting and grafting and grafting. But I think if I did that, I would get less done than I would working a more moderate amount of time. There's no way of me saying this without sounding like I'm a slacker, but I think especially when you're trying to do something creative, taking that downtime, sometimes taking an hour off and then writing for an hour, you can come out with more than you would have if you'd been sat at your desk for 2 hours trying to write for 2 hours. And same with taking like a change of scene. The amount of times I always joke that the days that my most productive days are the ones where I take my car in for like a service, and I take my laptop and I have to go to like a Costa Coffee around the corner or something and just use their Wi-Fi, because it's just the change of scenery sometimes inspires me to write a lot more stuff, and I'll sort of almost be sad when the garage rings me and says the car's ready to come and collect. But yeah, I think some downtime for me is essential for sort of making the uptime actually productive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So yeah, it's good to find that balance, and I'm glad a number of people I've spoken to are still saying how much they're trying to find that balance. So the fact that you've sort of got there on your own and not burnt yourself out in that respect is encouraging for others, I think, to be fair. Other people that want to go into content creation, that see these various people you mentioned, like Matt Colville earlier, who we perceive to be working 24/7 and around the clock, but everybody's got to find that time for themselves, as you mentioned. Even if
and there's often like a bit of a weird pressure to like appear that you're always working, and I've definitely felt that kind of guilt, because like I say, like that first time when I took an afternoon off, I was like, no one can know about this. I've got to be like constantly checking my emails, so if someone emails me to ask about an order or something, they don't know that I'm not at work. But it's like with so many things, the boring answer is it probably varies massively person to person.
Yeah.
But I think experimentation is the key to finding like what actually works for you.
Yeah, of course. You mentioned there bringing things to the table and experimenting, playtesting, and playing games. You mentioned running the first session of Primeval Bastionland. Do you use safety tools? How do you ensure that everyone at your table or the table you're at is sort of involved, engaged, and sort of safe in that respect?
Yeah, it's so for a bit of background, I do play with friends from time to time, sort of like friends that I've known for like a long time. But because we're all kind of at an age now where people have got kids and we've perhaps live in different parts of the country, it's like more and more difficult to like get together with the kind of the people who I perhaps know best in the world. So most of my gaming now happens in like meetup places. So I'm lucky enough to I live in Manchester in the UK, and it's got quite a vibrant kind of gaming community, really. So I go to a weekly board gaming and RPG meetup that has a higher attendance than some conventions I've been to.
Wow.
You're talking probably a sort of, I reckon, about 50 people, 60 people a week. And there's usually at least a few people who are there for the first time, and they're coming in and they're sort of saying, "Oh, I heard about this through a friend. I've heard about D&D. Maybe they're on their own. Maybe they're there with someone else. But yeah, you deal with a lot of brand new players, which is amazing because you can learn a lot from running games for brand new people that don't have sort of the same. I say this as someone who does have their own baggage, but doesn't come with the baggage of someone who perhaps has been playing games for 20 years. Yeah. And like I say, I include myself in there, so I can say that. But yeah, it's in terms of safety tools that if I'm running a game at a sort of that I've planned ahead of time, I will if there are going to be if there is going to be content in there that needs a sort of a content note, I will put that in ahead of time. But to be honest, I tend not to run anything that has too many dark themes. I have used the X card from time to time on the table, but I don't think I've ever actually seen it used. I think I run a very light-hearted table, and that doesn't mean that you don't have to consider these things. But I think I've been fortunate in the sense that I've not run up against too many problems. But the good thing is there's so much guidance out there now that. That it's certainly something to research sort of ahead of time before running a game.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, we have covered a lot. To be fair, I'm looking down on my notes, and we've gone from Into the Odd, which is the reason I reached out to you in the first place because of this beautiful book. Please scroll down, follow those links, and purchase either the hard copy or the PDF from the various places listed below. And as mentioned before, and we'll hear again very shortly. And we've gone through eras and game styles and game types and things like that. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you want to bring up just towards the end of this interview?
I think one of the things I was thinking about, so I'm sorry to like reveal behind the curtain, but you sent me a little bit of a kind of an idea of some of the things you might be asking about in the podcast as we were sort of talking by email before this. And I started looking at I read one of the questions and I actually kind of misread the question, and I thought I had an answer that I thought I was quite happy with, and then I reread the question. I thought, no, that's not actually what the question is asking. I like a politician's answer. But I think one of the things I always want to stress to people is I'm aware that the new version of Into the Odd is a very kind of shiny, luxurious. It's a very nicely made book on very nice paper, and it's got lots of very beautiful artwork in here. So even though it's got all this kind of luxury lining, the thing I always want to stress to people when they've asked me about making games is the barrier to entry to make a game now. It's not perfect. There are still obstacles to entry for people, but it's in a better place than it was in the past, which might not be saying very much. But I also think sometimes the barriers to entry are even lower than they might seem, especially when I can only speak to sort of the writing side of things, really, although I have done some publishing. But in terms of the writing, I think it's easy to think that to write this kind of game you have to have some incredibly literary background, or you have to be to be able to call yourself a writer, you need to have some kind of academic background, neither of which I really have. And I think everybody has something in their lived experience that they can write about, and if you draw on that, it doesn't necessarily matter so much if you don't have that kind of hugely literary or hugely academic background. So I would really just encourage people to start writing about what they know, start writing about the things that crop up in your head, no matter how silly you think it is. Because we have a broad enough audience now that somebody out there, it will click with them and they will find something to connect with there.